Thanks for the warm introduction from the Fortinet guys. It's very great to be here. Tonight, my introduction to you is partly about software development, but more about mindset. So I'm not going to be diving, as I spoke to a few people out in the foyer, I'm not going to be diving too deep into methodology or tooling or necessarily what you should do. I'm not actually going to give you anything too concrete or actionable to take back to your teams tomorrow. Instead, I'm going to be asking you to change the way you think when you approach these teams and deliver better applications. I'm a development manager. Basically, that means I'm a team lead of team leads at Coolblue. This talk isn't about Coolblue, though. It is about, you, I hope. I'm going to try and use some stories tonight to help you understand the context that I'm coming from and hopefully leave here feeling inspired to think about failure, think about making mistakes differently. I've been a developer. I do have the same background as a lot of you. I've been a developer for a long time, starting with COM and then VB6, and then .NET was a thing, and that sounded pretty cool. And I'm based in Rotterdam. So I've been living in the Netherlands now for ongeveer 5 jaar, almost 5 years. My Dutch is absolutely horrible because I'm, according to you guys, south of the river, so it doesn't count. And this is about as far north as I've been, ever. So you can feel free to bag on me later for that. If you want to continue the conversation later, hit me up on my email or on Twitter, either or is fine. Like I said, tonight I'm going to be telling you some stories, using some examples, telling you some short stories about failure, or hopefully by the end of the night you'll recognize that maybe it's not necessarily failure. It's maybe not as clear-cut. I'm going to start with this one. Do any of you recognize this picture? Harrisburg, yeah? Did you spend some time in the States? No? Okay. Well, then you've probably studied human engineering, or at least you know where I'm going with this one. This is 3 Mile Island. This is a nuclear reactor on the creatively named 3 Mile Island, just outside of, Pennsylvania, just outside of Harrisburg. It's an amazing reactor. It's an amazing work of art. It was started, they started building it in 1968 or so. It went into commission in 1978. December 30th of 1978 was its first day live. And it had, at least one half of it, had a nuclear meltdown, the largest nuclear meltdown that they've had in the United States, 3 months later on March 30th, 1979. So it was running live for 3 months. Massive cost to build, massive cost to get operational, and then it was live for 3 months. So the first of many questions that I have for you guys, was this a failure? How many of you think that that's a horrible, horrible failure? To have a nuclear reactor with that amount of investment, all of a sudden now it's offline. Yeah? Yeah? Sure, that's fine. All right? Okay. Great. Remember that. The next example, the next story that I'm going to try and weave into the story, the story of this evening, is this one, Space Shuttle Columbia. How many of you know the story of the Space Shuttle Columbia? A few. I see a few nodding hands, a few raised hands. Perfect. Basically, this was a very, very successful space shuttle for a very long period of time. It did 27 missions. It left Earth 27 times. And returned 27 times. It actually left Earth 28 times and didn't come back on the last time. Massive investment, did 12 days, it took off the 28th time, did 12 days in space with 7 scientists, 7 astronauts on board, and then completely disintegrated on the way back into Earth. Was this a failure? Yeah? How many of you think that this was a failure? You've killed 7 people at a massive cost, but you did, a fair bit of stuff before that. Yeah? There's a few. All right. I'm going to use an example that's a little bit closer to home. Yeah? How many of you know this one? Come on. You've all used Ideal, right? Introduced into the Netherlands in around about 2005, I believe. It now processes, or it has processed over 2 billion transactions to date and does roughly, I think, 500,000 a year, or 500 million a year. I'm getting my numbers all wrong, please excuse me. these guys guarantee a 99.88% uptime in their peak hours and not far off that in their non-peak hours. I think it's 98.5% uptime. Late last year, they had one of their biggest outages. We'll get to how they found out about their biggest outage later. Spoiler alert a little bit, but their SLA towards the end of last year for 1 month dropped pretty significantly, 97, 96 point something, during peak time as people were ramping up for Black Friday, for Christmas, for Sinterklaas, for these sorts of events. How many of you think that Ideal, one of the biggest payment gateways in the Netherlands, dropping below its SLA in peak times, how many of you think that that is clearly a failure? Yeah, at least a few of you. All right. Allow me to introduce you to the topic of second stories. All right. How many of you, before I get started, because I'm hoping there's a few of you, how many of you know what a second story is in this context? None? Awesome. That's incredible. I don't have anyone that's going to come up to me afterwards and go, well, actually. So thank you. The idea of second stories is probably best outlined in this book. If you haven't read this book, I would recommend it, and not just because it's been written by a fellow Australian, Dr. Sidney Dekker. This is the Field Guide to Understanding Human Error, and you'll notice human error is in quotes there, deliberately so. Okay? The best quote that I can pull out of this book for the context of this evening is this one, and it's that underneath every simple, obvious story about human error, there is a much deeper, more complex story about the organisation in which that error occurred. All right? So I've given you 3 very high-level examples, very simple stories so far, and asked you, are they failures? Right? And you, about half of you each time, said yes. Yes, definitely a failure. Tonight I want to introduce you to the concept of going deeper than just failing your SLA or just having a nuclear meltdown, simple little things, and try and dive a little bit deeper and figure out what led to that. And that's great, but what is a second story? Okay. And for this, I'm going to break it up into 2 concepts. In the book, it's actually described as the new way of thinking and the old way of thinking. But it's easier for me to consider these things first stories and second stories. Okay? In a first story, that's basically the story that I've told you so far. Human error, the mistakes that led up to a point, are the cause of the failure. People made wrong decisions. Right? Someone didn't do something. No one noticed what was going on. But if you turn that round and you introduce this idea of the new way of thinking or a second story, human error is seen as the effect of systemic vulnerabilities deeper inside the organisation. Right? Systemic things led to people making those mistakes, but I don't want to jump too far ahead of myself. And for the record, these are some of my driest slides that I've ever made, so again, I apologise about that. The second aspect of a first story, yes, I know, it's confusing, is that saying what people should have done is a satisfying way for us to describe their mistake. Right? If only NASA had made a different decision about bringing the space shuttle in, those people wouldn't be dead. Right? Half of that sentence is fair, and I would say the other half you need to understand much more that there is much more complexity behind that decision. So instead, saying what people should have done doesn't necessarily explain why they did what they ended up doing. Right? Why did it make sense for NASA, to use that example, to bring 7 astronauts back from space and eventually have them burn up in the atmosphere? Right? That's a horrible accident. It's a horrible thing to happen to anybody, right? We want to think that it's not a conscious, why did that make sense, right? I'll get to the punchline later if no one wakes up and comes to work and wants to do a bad job, but why did that make sense to someone to make that decision? That's what I want you guys to, and I'll show you some patterns as we go along this evening. The third part is that telling people to be more careful, introducing more rules, introducing barriers, forcing people to go slower, actually makes the problem go away. And for me, that's a lazy way to address these problems. Right? Adding rules to a system so that someone can't do something is simple and straightforward and makes sense, sure, but you're not fixing the underlying error. You're not fixing the underlying incentivization. So for me, only by seeking out its vulnerabilities can organizations or clients or companies that you're all working at enhance the safety of the systems and the decisions that you make. All right? So tonight we're going to be focusing on these ones and trying to change your thinking from, good God, they made a horrible mistake, into maybe there was more at play. And if you guys and girls, if everyone here tonight goes home and thinks to themselves about the situations that I'm describing, the stories that I'm telling you, and thinks, well, maybe there's more to that, or if there's a production outage at your client or your customer or your company tomorrow, and you think to yourself, how did we get here? Then I've done a good job tonight. Or I don't know, maybe I've just inspired you. I don't know whether I'm doing a good job. I'm relying on you guys to come tell me that in the break afterwards. So for me, to recap all of this, because I see some of you furiously taking notes, this sentence is a lot easier to remember it by. It's the real story of the complexity of the environments that people work in, or in which people work. It fits better on the slide with this. So let's go back to the stories. Let's go back to the examples I gave. They were quite simple, right? The way that I described them was rather blasé, and that was quite deliberate. 3 Mile Island, there is for those of you that don't know the story of 3 Mile Island, the proper story of 3 Mile Island, there's a gentleman called Nicholas Means that does an amazing keynote speech about the real story behind 3 Mile Island, which formed inspiration for some of these examples. And I would advise you to go watch that after tonight, okay? It's linked towards the end. I'll give you the name again later. But he dives into what systematic faults, errors were made in the systems that led to such a catastrophic outcome, okay? But for us, we're going to start here, and I'm going to make it very, very simple for you, okay? In a nuclear reactor, how many of you know how a nuclear reactor works? On a rudimentary level, yeah? I'm not going to ask you to, nuclear fission. That's basically in a nuclear reactor, in a building of this size, in a setup like this, you basically have a hot side and a cold side. And the job is to make the cold side hot and then make it cold again. And when you make it hot, that produces steam. Steam turns turbines. You guys have enough windmills to understand that logic, all right? Then you cool it down again and you repeat the process over and over again. In 3 Mile Island, something really simple stopped working. Right? One of their condensate polishers, I don't want to get too difficult, plus also it's hard for me to remember all the exact stats. Nicholas does a much better job of that. Basically, one of the circulating water pump, or the condenser that you see here on this side, the condensate pump, stopped working. So there was no more cold water coming through the nuclear reactor. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, that makes things quite hot, but these reactors are designed for this to be okay. It's fine for people to jump into the cold side of a nuclear reactor and do regular maintenance. So the condensate polisher going offline, or the condenser, or any of the pumps, anything on the cold side, it's fine. They can go in there, they can do their maintenance, and they can get out again. It's quite safe. There's no exposure to nuclear reactions, no exposure to radiation, or very limited exposure to radiation, only by proximity. But these things are set up so that you can maintain this side. Maintaining the hot side is a lot more difficult. I'm glad I'm not one of those people, because that's quite scary, in my opinion, especially for those of you that understand how a nuclear reactor works. You know that this is, for all intents and purposes, magic. Basically, yeah, one of the components on the cold side of the system stopped working, which stopped the cold water going through the nuclear reactor. Now, a nuclear reactor needs to moderate its own temperature, and it does that by raising and lowering control rods into the nuclear core, right, where the nuclear reaction is actually taking place. So all you need to do, in theory, is you've stopped the cold water coming through, you lift the control rods up, there's no more nuclear reaction. You can, if you need to, you can scram a reactor, which is a horrible thing, but very interesting to watch on YouTube if you're keen in disaster. Go check that stuff out later. Basically, these things were all self-maintained. Instead, a whole bunch of systematic decisions were made that led to none of that happening, that led to the control rods scramming, sinking to the bottom of the nuclear vessel. I don't know what else to call that. Sorry, I'm losing my words. And the nuclear reactor continued to react, right? Continued to get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter until there was, unfortunately, many hours later, a very big disaster. Okay? But why? Why? Now, this is 1978, 1978, 1979, around about that stage. This is the control room. This is an actual photo of the control room that these gentlemen, because back then it was all gentlemen, were working in. Right? This was a state-of-the-art environment, a brand new nuclear reactor. They had everything at their disposal. They had government money, they had 15 years to build the thing, they knew exactly what they wanted in it, and so they built this. But there's one small flaw there. Right? The one button, this is actually interesting, this is a simulation that the American government have set up in a museum over there, which is why I asked the gentleman up the back if he'd ever been to Harrisburg or been and seen this simulator. This is the tour guide pointing out the one button that would have saved everything. If only he'd pressed this button. Right? If only someone had come along and bumped this button, right? They wouldn't be that far out of pocket. So why wasn't that button pressed? Why did no one come along and think, oh, this will solve our problem? Because of these. These are their monitoring screens, right? Now, Henry and Patrick, the guys that come after me tonight, they're going to be telling you stories about, especially Henry, you're talking about logging and monitoring this evening. Yeah. These are their equivalent of that in 1978, 1979. We can do better now, I hope. I trust you're going to show better than LCD panels. These were inch by inch little panels that held a little red light. And there's two problems with that. One is that when the nuclear reactor was working normally, naturally, healthily, right, in a good state, half of those lights were red. There's good reason for that, right? Things are going online and offline all the time. I told you, you can walk into the cold side of a nuclear reactor and do regular maintenance. A pump going offline, that's not a big deal. We can solve that, right? The next shift will come in and send a mechanic down and it'll be fine, right? So half of these lights at any given time were red. And the second thing is that there was no way to tell when they went red. Right? You look at the wall, the light's red. How long's it been red? I don't know. But this is 1978. They're smarter than this, right? As we are today. And they went, how can we solve that problem? We'll solve that problem by putting a dot matrix printer in the other corner. Right? Now, how many of you are old enough to remember dot matrix printers? Yeah, at least the noise they made, right? Like it's like a modem. You can't get it out of your head after a while. So there's a dot matrix printer sitting over in the corner, and the idea was that every time a light turns on, the dot matrix printer prints a line. But that dot matrix printer was connected via a 300 baud connection, state of the art at the time. Trust me, you don't want to know how slow that is now. And it started with all these lights going off regularly, long enough, triggering on and off, right? That printer got very, very backed up. Let alone the fact that the printer was just noisy, and you become... How many have you ever worked in next to an airfield or next to a train line, right? Lived in a city. I live in Rotterdam. The city noise becomes, part of the background, right? This dot matrix printer going nuts in the corner, that was part of the background. So they had taught themselves, they had learnt to ignore it. Right? You hear the printer going, the idea was if you heard the printer going off, you need to walk over and you need to see what the printer says. Right? But it had been going off for so long that they just switched off. They ignore, the printer's probably telling us that the lift is broken, right? The printer's probably telling us that one of the water pumps is only running at 80% capacity, right? These are systemic failures in a much, much larger, modern, state-of-the-art facility. Right? Each individual problem was identified and solved by someone during the construction of this. There was no money spared in building this at the time, right? Today we can think of all sorts of beautiful ways to solve these problems, and that's the benefit that we have of hindsight bias. There's two big types of bias that we're going to come across tonight. One is hindsight bias, and the other one is outcome bias. I'll use outcome bias in the next story. Hindsight bias, how many of you understand what hindsight bias is? Some. Great. Very, very quickly, it's the ability for you to turn around and go, oh, well, I would have done it differently. Right? I wouldn't have connected it via 300 baud because that's not enough to handle a steady flow of alerts. I wouldn't have put all those lights up on the wall, right? I would have found a better way. Hindsight bias is your ability to look at what was happening and say, I would have done it better. I would have done it differently. We all work with that guy. That's the 10 times jerk that's on your team, right? That person's input that comes back and says to you time and time again, oh, but I wouldn't have done it that way, right? That's hindsight bias. And that's horrible. So now that you know what you know about this nuclear reactor meltdown, and again, I haven't gone into anywhere near as much detail as you need to answer this question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. How many of you think that the fact that this had a nuclear accident, the biggest one in American history, was a failure? Still a few. Good. Good. And it's good that you're that skeptical, right? Tonight, hopefully, like I said, I didn't give you enough information to make a clear decision on this, in my opinion, right? And I'm trying to tell you some stories. So that should give you a warning sign, at least. I'm going to go a little bit quicker now for the Space Shuttle Columbia. Previously, when I was telling you about the Space Shuttle Columbia, I said, yeah, it left Earth 28 times, it came back 27 times, it cost a lot of money, it killed 7 people, and that was about as deep as I went. But instead, I want to show you this. This is a still frame. This is a freeze frame of a video that the control center had when the Space Shuttle Columbia left Earth for the last time. Right? This is the exact moment that a piece of foam that was designed to fall off the fuel tank hit the wing. Spoiler alert, foam falling off a fuel tank is very different to foam falling off a fuel tank and hitting a wing, especially when you're leaving Earth at 30,000 kilometers an hour. Okay? So they knew that something had happened. So what did they do? They made a slide deck. And I'm not kidding, this is the actual slide. Right? There is an amazing blog post that I will link you to by James Thomas here called Death by PowerPoint, the slide that killed 7 people. And if you've got any sort of manager in your organization that loves sending you slide decks and saying, my job here is done, send them back this. All right? It's only relatively new, but I wish it had been here for the last time I did this talk. This is the actual slide from the actual slide deck that helped NASA to make the decision to bring those people back into Earth. That killed 7 people. But why? Now, for those of you that have been reading the slide deck, I'm going to ask you to focus on the title. How many of you have a solid understanding of what that sentence means? None. Perfect. Right answer. Thank you. Right? Review of test data. So we've had a look into our archives, what we've tested, indicates conservatism for tile penetration. So the tile would have penetrated the wing conservatively. Right? Just jumbling the English words up a bit, that's basically what we get out of this. Right? I would argue it's a nonsense sentence and doesn't say anything, but if we're trying to be polite and think positively, right, that's what it comes up, translates into. You'll also notice that there's 4 different subsets of bullets here. All right? Not really any rhyme or reason, not really any sort of structure, not really telling any sort of story. Maybe some of you will give me the same feedback about my talk later. That's fine. I'm open to that feedback. This bottom one here, flight condition is significantly outside of test database. And the sub bullet point underneath that, the last bullet point on the slide, says volume of ramp, which, just so you know, ramp is another name, that a piece of jargon that they referred to foam as. So volume of foam, allow me to translate this for you as we go along. Volume of foam is 1920 cubic inches. Now, We're thankfully in a country that uses logical measurements, so 1920 cubic inches is roughly 30 litres. So imagine a bucket of water. But you're talking about foam. Foam is less dense than water, so you're talking about quite a big piece of foam, right? That'll put things into size. So you've got volume of foam is 30 litres versus 3 cubic inches for our test. So when they tested, because like I said, they knew that foam falling off the tank was a thing, right? When they tested that scenario, they used 3 cubic inches, which is to our 30 litre bucket of water is roughly a bottle cap, right? So this sub-bullet point says, what we're testing or what has happened is significantly different. Significantly different. Not like, oh, well, we tested with 15 litres and 30 litres hit the wing. No, we tested with a bottle cap going 30,000 kilometres an hour. It's very easy to remember the numbers in English. This is why I love the in the metric system. This is why I love it. 30,000 kilometres an hour, 30 mils of water versus 30 litres of water. Nice round numbers. So the conclusion they came to was, oh, well, the flight conditions, so the spacecraft as it is in space, is significantly outside of what we tested for. But that's not what this says. That's not what this says at all. So when you're watching Henry later on, when you're watching Patrick in the next session, right, make sure that what you're telling people is what's actually happening. Okay? Don't coach it in this sort of language. But then, why did they? You ask yourself, it's very easy for me to stand up here and say to you, don't do this, right? But why did they do this? Because this is the environment that they had. This is what was normal for them. So if this is what's normal for them, how many of you would still consider the space shuttle coming back in a failure? A few. Yeah, it's all right. There's no right or wrong, right? And now really quickly, I'm going to go through Ideal. A great example of Ideal. I love Ideal. I hold absolutely no ill will towards Ideal, and I love the work that they do. I'm just going to put that up the front because what I'm going to share with you next might come across the other way. All right? I work for a company that hopefully produces smiles, right? And we were talking to a company that doesn't have the same focus as we do, put simply. All right? And we track a lot of stuff at Coolblue. We track payments, we track shipments, we track orders, we track all sorts of crazy stuff, okay? One thing we track is how many payments are coming through, because it's quite important, as you can imagine in e-commerce, that you get paid, right? And we saw all payments through Ideal stop. Now, it's not uncommon, because Ideal is just a gateway, it's not uncommon to see payments for one or more banks stop occasionally. So if ABN AMRO has a maintenance window, you'll notice them go offline and you'll still get ING payments and you'll still get bunk payments, right? If ING has an outage, right, accidental outage, then like they did at roughly the same time last year, then you'll stop seeing ING payments, but you'll still see traffic through Ideal. And in this case, we stopped seeing traffic through Ideal, which for us is quite scary. Right? So we called them, I'm a manager, I'm allowed to say we. Someone from Coolblue called them and said, hey, we think you've got a problem. And the customer service person on the other end of the line, the first, second, third level support person, our account manager, whoever was on the other end of the line from their company said, no, we don't, everything here is green. Right? You've clearly got something wrong on your side. This is not us. Our stuff says green. Everything's green. And why did they say that? Because this is what their motto is. This is what they're standing behind. This is the information that they have. The first sentence here is enough. Ideal should always be available 24 hours per day. Punt. Full stop. Right? Like, that is enough. Ideal should always be available. So of course the first answer is always going to be like, no, clearly it's your problem. Thank you. Right? And I don't hold any ill will towards them for saying that because everything was green on their side, everything was fine. Right? But over time, over the next, let's say half hour or so, they started realizing, wait a minute, we've actually got a problem. And they called us back about 45 minutes later and said, actually, mea culpa. Yeah, you were right. We're doing some emergency maintenance, and we'll be right back. Okay. So how many of you think that them dropping below their SLA and them not listening to us because we were just a noisy customer that wanted them to be available for us, how many of you think that that was a failure? Yeah, cool. Great. And I think that's because of this. You want there to be someone, in every story that I've told you so far tonight, you want there to be someone that you can point your finger at. You want there to be a third party. You want there to be someone else on your team. You want there to be someone else, ideally on someone else's team, right? Where you can say it's their fault, all right? But this is where I want you to come back to the second stories. I've given you a lot more information now about each of these environments, more than enough to make a decision that this wasn't failure and there shouldn't be blame applied. But let me explain myself why before you all lynch me, okay? And it comes to this one, just culture. And this isn't woke culture, this is just culture. Slightly different, very different goals. How many of you know what just culture is or have heard the term before? A few, cool. Just culture is actually very well defined, very well defined. It's in an EU regulation. That's how well defined it is. Right? And for those of you that have ever done cookie or GDPR work, you know that these things are very well defined. And this is from 2010. This is an EU regulation from 2010. They have this page, Article 2, nestled down the bottom, and specifically this paragraph here says just culture means a culture in which frontline operators or others are not punished for actions, omissions, or decisions taken by them that are commensurate with their experience and training. They go on to say, but where gross negligence, willful violation, and destructive acts are also not tolerated, of course, that's fine, right? But the first part, if you didn't know not to do something and you did something, it's not your fault. Now, why is this in a regulation? Because this was about the aerospace industry. This is about the airlines. This is about under-reporting maintenance hours or over-reporting maintenance done, okay? Over-reporting maintenance hours. They needed to institute some sort of rule, some sort of learning about just culture so that the airline operators wouldn't get in trouble, provided there was no gross negligence, provided there was not willful violation, right? But that's airline industry, and that's legal, and that's GDPR, and that's EU regulation stuff. That's ugly, right? So what does this mean for us in tech? For me, this is a method of investigating mistakes in a way that focuses on the situational aspects of a failure's mechanism, as well as the decision-making process of people proximate to the failure. Now, I've read these words to you, but they're not actually my words. They're words from John Allspore, and it's kind of still a mouthful. Instead, most people refer to this as a blameless postmortem. And I see a few of you nodding, so let me jump straight in. Right? How many of you have held a blameless postmortem? At least a few. All right, good. Blameless postmortems are not a new thing. Blameless postmortems have been around forever. Most big tech companies, spoiler alert, have written something about how cool they are because they do this. All right? And when I say most big tech companies, it's a full chapter in Google's SRE book. It's a whole section of the website for Atlassian and their Jira Ops section. It is a blog post on Etsy. It is a Medium post. It's getting lesser, I know, but stick with me, right? It's a Hootsuite Engineering wrote about how they do it and how they use the 5 whys, and even PagerDuty, right? One of the biggest monitoring, alerting, logging, notifying systems out there, right? Talks about how they do it for themselves when they have an outage, which is kind of bad, because if your monitoring tools have an outage, then who's monitoring the monitors, who's watching the watchman, it all kind of cascades into a pile of rubble by then. So all these guys have written about it, but they all lead back to this one. Any of you guys know who this is? I kind of gave it away on an earlier slide, come on. No? Yeah, I heard someone mention it. This is John Allspore. And he wrote this blog post in May 2012, right, talking about a blameless postmortem and a just culture at Etsy. He was a relatively high, I think he was a CTO of Etsy, or if not CTO, he was quite highly ranked as an engineering manager at Etsy at the time. And most would argue that he kicked this off. Okay? So you think to yourself, I've introduced postmortems, I've followed the Google SRE book, I've followed the checklists, I've read all the articles from PagerDuty and everything on Medium that I can find, and I'm there, right? I can say, yes, we do blameless postmortems, we're not going to blame anybody for anything anymore, and we can put a check in that box when my manager comes and says who's at fault, right? You can answer the question quite simply with, oh, no one, boss, right? And I'd say, yeah, if you know all of this so far, you're kind of there. Kind of there. If this was all you took out of today, hey, I should go and research blameless postmortems, then I'll be happy, all right? But allow me to go 2 steps deeper. I want to rewind and show you what happened before that 2012 blog post and what John Allspore and what other people have attributed that, what John's blog post has culminated from, okay? And I'm going to start with my personal favorite book. Now, if any of you have attended my talks before, you'll know that I try and stitch this into just about every single one I do. I'm almost going to be starting to ask for commissions. This is John C. Maxwell's book from 2010, quite dated now, or as dated as 9 years is in tech. But the best quote out of this, one that I've held on to and one that I try and impart on my teams, is that you should fail early, fail often, but always fail forward. All right? The essence of a blameless postmortem is that you don't make the same mistake again. So that's basically the same as failing forward. Right? Allow the mistake to happen, figure out why it happened, and then move on. That book comes after this one. And if you thought that book was dry, let me tell you, this is the driest 25 euros you can buy. All right? This is the Academy of Management Journal. It's only available on JSTOR, which is an academic publishing system. You would have used it in university and probably forgotten about it very promptly after leaving. This is an article titled, and bear with me, The Psychological Conditions of Personal Engagement and Disengagement at Work. All right, written by a very smart guy. It's an awesome article if you can read all of it, right? If you stay awake through all of it. The biggest quote that I've pulled out of this for you here today is that psychological safety, and many say that this was the first mention of psychological safety in a work environment, psychological safety is being able to show and employ oneself, who you truly are, without fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career. And Kahn in this case wasn't talking about, Professor Kahn in this case, wasn't talking about tech. He wasn't talking about airline industries. He wasn't talking about blameless postmortems. He wasn't talking about nuclear meltdowns. He was talking about psychological safety of yourself. Okay? So if you can be yourself and you're allowed to fail forward and you've got blameless postmortems and an environment at work that allows you to get away with these things, yeah, bear with me, and all these big accidents happen, what comes next? Right? Well, you say, yeah, I'm safe. I told my boss I made a mistake, but it's your fault because you didn't tell me not to. And, then all of a sudden you go, yeah, check in the box and we're done. Right? And I'd say, well, if psychological safety, just culture, and those examples that I've given you tonight are all you take from here and you research blameless postmortems, and if this is as far as you get through my talk, then I'm also okay with that. But I want to go one step further. Okay? One step further. Even earlier than 1990 was 1989. And everyone that groaned in this room knows where I'm going with this. This is the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It is some say a mainstay of most technical teams. Most companies will have it on the bookshelf. It has sold, I think, more copies than any other book that ever existed except for the Bible. It's a management staple, right? It gets recommended to you by any manager that's having trouble with you ever. I'm glad that elicited a laugh. I was a bit worried about that one. But this, in 1989, said one thing. It said our behavior, our individual behavior, is a function of our decisions, not our conditions. And I think that's very, very nicely put a whole bunch of stuff together. The condition that you're making these decisions in, the decisions that you're making, are a function of your behavior, right? Your behavior is a function of our decisions, and I would argue it goes back the same way as well. Your decisions come out of your chosen behavior. Okay? Let that sink in for a minute, because basically this says those mistakes, they were your fault all along. All right, blameless postmortems, just culture aside. So, knowing now that you're put in an environment and you're told, don't worry, it's blameless. We've got blameless postmortems in a just culture. You're interviewing somewhere and they stick it up on the wall and it's amazing and you're happy and you're sold. And then you realize, but why am I making these choices? Why do my choices lead to these sorts of mistakes? And this is where second stories come in. So this is going to circle all the way back to the start and simplify it a bit. Really quickly, I'm going to give you 3 questions that you should ask at work. So I told you I wasn't going to give you any actions. I wasn't going to tell you about the newest JavaScript framework that you need to use tomorrow, right? Instead, I'm going to give you 3 questions for when something goes wrong next. And I hope for your sake that's not tomorrow. But if it is, you've got these 3 questions. I want you to ask yourself and the people around you, what happened that led to this moment? What happened? Not who, what. What happened that led to this moment? Why? Did that make sense to the operators? Right? Why did that make sense for that to happen to the people that were allowing that to happen? And then how did we manage to get ourselves into this state? If you can ask, I'll get out of the way of the photos, sorry. If you can ask yourself those 3 questions next time something goes wrong, then I think you're well on your way to finding the next second story. All right? And to show you that this is actually quite simple, I'm going to circle all the way back to my examples. Okay? 3 Mile Island, nuclear reactor destroyed. What happened? Alerts were ignored. A dot matrix printer was going nuts in the corner that no one paid attention to. Sorry. Why did this happen? Because the printer was always going nuts, because the monitors were always red, because the situation allowed it to be that way, right? And how is that possible? Because no one changed it. No one looked at this brand new state-of-the-art environment and said, oh, that dot matrix printer's kind of not the best way to do this. No one asked themselves, how can we make this better? So what happened? Why do this? And how is it possible? Space Shuttle Columbia. Right. Horrible, horrible accident. What happened? They were given this slide deck. Why were they given this slide deck? Because this is the environment they grew up in. This is NASA, this is very highly enterprisey, and you're not allowed to say anything but coach all your words with maybe and conservative and yeah, let's use ramp instead of foam because, you know, that's what we do. And most of this slide is coached in jargon, only specific or only known by the people in that room as well. How is this possible? Because no one called them on this. No one said, well, what does that actually mean? Does that mean we can bring them in safely? Because I believe that if anyone had asked that, they would have got a different answer than what's written on the slide. We don't know. An ideal, what happened? They had an outage. They had unexpected downtime. That's normal. That's a normal part of distributed systems, as I'm sure Patrick's going to tell you in a few minutes. Why did this happen? Because it's a normal part of distributed systems. You need to build systems for resiliency. You need to be aware that there will be outages. There's a reason that it's not 100% on your SLA. It's a reason why most big, perfectly structured organizations are still only 5 nines. How is this possible? Because it's a distributed system. Because it's not perfect. And if you can answer those 3 questions, then that's the second story that you're trying to solve, because your behavior then needs to become fixing that second story. So the 3 actions, I've given you 3 questions, I'm going to give you 3 matching actions, and I'm on my last 5 slides for those guys at the back that are worried about time. First of all, find the incentivization. You've now asked yourself these 3 questions, right? What incentivized the environment to be like that? You can imagine in NASA with that slide deck, yeah, that was the way that it was, right? You were not incentivized to speak up against your boss if your boss said, yeah, but what does that actually mean? And no one wanted to look stupid in that sort of an environment. So ask what is responsible, not who, not it's my manager's fault, but instead what is broken here. The second one, do what you can, and this is my action for you, do what you can to enable the right outcome. Spend a little bit extra time on those tests. Report things that you see. Change your behaviors, all right? Seek forward accountability, not backwards. Not Jimmy broke the system again, but how can I make it so that Jimmy can't break the system next time? Forward accountability. And the last one, the biggest one of the evening, hopefully the one that I've shown you through the examples today, assume positive intent. All of this works if you assume positive intent. No one comes to work wanting to do a bad job. If you do, you probably need to change jobs. No one should get out of work and come to work wanting to do a bad job. All right? So assume positive intent. Then, in my opinion, then you're there. Then you can check the box. If you've done those 3 actions after asking those 3 questions, then you're there. Okay? So, I told you that I was going to tell you some stories. This is some of the references from this slide deck. I will make it available for you later. Thanks. I think I'm 5 minutes over. No? Have I got time to answer one of these questions?
Yeah, are there any questions in the public?
There's a few back here.
One moment.
Did it take a lot of time to change the culture? I mean, especially for people who grew up in blaming management culture.
Yep.
That the team opens up to find the real cause? Because, for instance, in the first one,
Yep.
why didn't you look at the printer? It was your job to look at the printer.
Of course, right? But it was your job to look at the printer. It was your job to look at the printer. So if you assume positive intent and assume that someone wanted to watch the printer but just was in an environment where they weren't able to, then the question becomes, why was the printer not monitored? What can we do to make the printer monitored, if that's the outcome that you so choose, or the printer can't be monitored, so we need to change to a different system. Right. So I would rephrase the question into something actionable. So instead of pointing fingers, instead of saying, why weren't you watching the printer? I know I'm stealing your question and throwing it back at you, right? But instead of asking, why weren't you watching the printer? What were you doing? Maybe this is a better question. What were you doing that meant that you couldn't watch the printer? Yeah? So change the way you think in that regard. Assume positive intent. The person that was supposed to watch the printer in this example, right, didn't want to walk away from it. They were probably needed elsewhere. Especially when there's warnings and sirens and nuclear meltdown imminent. You know, that were probably needed elsewhere.
Yeah, especially we did a post-mortem and we saw that people are really protective and worried about blaming.
Yes. Yeah, you need to be mindful of that. But we can continue that question later. Thank you. It's a good question.
I was wondering why, or at least I'm under the impression that you think these 3 examples are not failures. Because
Yes.
they keep asking.
Yes.
But in my opinion, a failure is that, for instance, 3 Mile Island, I think they intended the nuclear site to work more than 3 months.
Yes.
And it didn't.
Yes.
So that's not.
I would say
as
that's.
it was intended. So
Yep.
that makes it, in my opinion, a failure. That's why I raise my hand every time.
Yep.
The second time you asked.
Yep.
So I think that failure and blame are not the same thing. Something can be a failure without being it's someone's fault. So I was wondering, why do you think these are not failures, but?
If I can use that example of the 3 Mile Island, the United States government put together a body to investigate how that happened. They spent, I think, a lot of money and at least 2 or 3 years and produced one of the best reports on incident outage that you will ever read. So if I'm going to recommend you one thing, go read that one. It is in the citations here. It was a learning moment for the whole nuclear industry. So losing $1.2 billion, American dollars, using 9 billion litres of water to clean it up over the course of 14 years, and letting it sit there on the island, I would argue is just a reminder on how to do things right. That's the cost that it costs to do things right and to have a reminder.
But in my opinion, it doesn't really change the
The outcome.
the outcome.
Yes.
The event in itself was a failure, and the fact that you can learn from it doesn't make it less of a failure.
Yeah, I had a very long conversation when I did this dry run with one of my peers, and we went over this exact topic for an hour and a half. So I would, I'm not even making this up. So yeah, no, allow me to continue the conversation after. Right? I think it's got a lot to do with the definition of failure. How do you define what a failure is?
Okay, maybe it's better if there are any further questions to ask them in the pause.
Of course.
Pat, I would like to thank you again.
I'm more than welcome to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for everything.
No, thank you.
Hope to see you next time again.
Indeed.
And for PhotoNet, it's a little surprise.
Thank you
Hope
very much.
Like it.
Thank
Can I
you.
have a big applause for Pat?
Thanks very much.